Hello and welcome to the Prelims Practice for the upcoming preliminary examination. Now, after covering three important subjects in terms of polity, environment and geography, let us start the fourth important subject, that is economy. Now, economy is a very dynamic subject and it has to be a balance of both the current affairs as well as the static portions. And in the static portion, you need to focus more on the conceptual clarity, because if you go through the previous year questions, you will find that questions have been asked based on application of these basic concepts, and also direct questions have been asked related to those basic concepts. Again, in this section, current affairs are very important, and dynamic questions from the current affairs can be asked from economic survey, budget, or other economy related news like the announcements that have been made by the RBI, any new kind of bank that is starting, or important decisions of the government and the RBI related to the banking sector. So in this series, we will be taking up three videos related to economy and which will be indicative in nature about the nature of questions that have been asked in the previous year. And based on that, we have designed the questions for this series. However, it needs to be reiterated that you should practice more number of questions from the prelims test series, which has also been designed based on the previous year questions that have been asked in the UPSC examination. Now, after this, let us take up the analysis of the previous year questions and let us look at the important areas in the economy from which UPSC has asked questions. And also, we will do a trend analysis of the topics that are being asked by the UPSC in the preliminary examination. Now, in the economy section, these are some of the important themes on which questions have been asked in the UPSC examination previously. And in this, there are some of the important themes which need a high level of conceptual clarity. For example, the basic concepts which are related to the measurement of economic growth. And in that, you need to be aware of important concepts like the gross domestic product, gross national product, national income, and what is the relationship between all these indicators which are used for measuring the economic growth. Again, you need to be aware of the economic history of India, and that will help you in answering some of the questions that are asked in the preliminary examination. Now, besides these, there are important topics like the fiscal policy of the government, the monetary policy which is announced by the RBI, and concepts like inflation, taxation, banking sector, balance of payment, etc. So these are the important themes that you need to cover while studying the economy section. Now, if you look at the trend in the economy section in the preliminary examination, you will find that more than 20 questions are being asked every year. And for example, in the years 2019 and 18 in the preliminary examination, there were more than 20 questions from the economy section. And if you look at the distribution within the economy section, you will find that questions have been asked related to basic concepts or the core concepts, the banking and finance, the external sector, important international institutions and reports, and also various government initiatives, policies, and the schemes. So, although the relative importance of these topics keep on changing, however, these are some of the important themes for your preliminary examination. Again, the conceptual clarity is very important in the economy section, and for that, you should always go through the macroeconomics NCRT of class 12th. And you will find in our discussion that a lot of questions have been asked directly from the important concepts that are discussed in the NCRT of macroeconomics. Besides this, you should also be aware of the important changes or initiatives regarding the taxation in India. And again, you can see that the most important topic in each section is the banking and finance. Similarly, this is the distribution of the questions that have been asked in the year 2017 and 16 respectively. And again, you can see that in the year 2016, the focus of UPSC was more on the international institutions and reports. And again, however, the questions were asked regularly from the banking and finance section. And you can find that 5 questions were asked in the year 2016 and 6 questions were asked in the year 2017. And again, government policies, schemes, and initiatives are a consistent area where questions are regularly asked by the UPSC. Now, in these sections, the important thing that needs to be noticed is that some of the questions are asked from the static portion, while majority of the questions related to economy are from the current affairs section. And for having a good understanding of the current affairs section, you can always go through the prelims compass of Indian economy and also the prelims compass of economic survey and budget, which has been released recently. And that will help you in having a focused preparation for the upcoming preliminary examination. So now if you look at the themes like the economic growth, taxation, planning and human development, you will find that questions have been asked related to the concepts like purchasing power parity, important objectives of the 5-year plans, how is poverty estimated in India, and also related to the concepts like social capital. Again, you can see that in the year 2018, questions have been asked related to human capital formation, recommendations of the FRBM review committee, and also important exemptions that have been allowed under goods and services tax. So these highlight that these include questions related to the basic concepts like the human capital formation and the social capital, as well as important current affairs like the recommendations of the FRBM review committee. Again, in the banking and finance sector, where majority of the questions are asked, most of the questions are related to the current affairs. However, at times, conceptual questions like the legal tender money are also asked, and this question related to the treasury bill was also a conceptual question. So do try to balance your preparation with important concepts as well as the important current affairs that are in news. Now, one of the most important area in the Indian economy is related to the international institutions, trade and index. And these are mostly current affairs in nature, and they have been covered exhaustively in the prelims compass every year. And they are covered exhaustively in the prelims compass of Indian economy. And a dedicated booklet is released related to the government schemes and initiatives, and important economy related initiatives are incorporated into the prelims compass of economy. So do go through the prelims compass, and that will help you in having a focused approach for the preliminary examination. So after this, let us start our discussion for the 10 questions that we have prepared from the Indian economy section. Now the first few questions that we are going to discuss here are related to the measurement of economic growth. So before solving these questions, let us look at the previous year questions related to the measurement of economic growth, or what are the parameters on which the economic growth is measured. So for example, if you look at this question, it was related to a concept of measuring economic growth, that is the purchasing power parity. Again, this question that was asked in the year 2018 was related to the per capita real gross national product. So by looking at these questions, we find that questions have been asked related to important parameters for measuring the economic growth. And that is why this becomes important for us from the exam point of view. Now, if you go through the NCERT of class 12, that is the macroeconomics, you will find the discussions related to various measures of measuring the economic growth. For example, it talks in detail about the measurement of gross domestic product, the gross national product, how are these both related, and also it talks about national income and per capita income. So do go through that chapter to understand the various ways in which the economic growth can be measured. And also it discusses about the various shortcomings in the way we have been measuring the economic growth in countries across the globe. So if you look at the question that was asked in the year 2019, it reads, consider the following statements, and the first is that the purchasing power parity exchange rates are calculated by comparing the prices of the same basket of goods and services in different countries. So it basically talks about the definition of the concept of purchasing power parity. And the second statement is related to India's position or ranking across the globe on this purchasing power parity parameter. So this PPP is basically a theory which compares the different countries' currency based on a basket of goods approach, and that is why the first statement given here is correct. However, the second statement is incorrect because in terms of PPP dollars, India's position is third across the globe. And that is why the second statement is incorrect. So the correct answer that comes out here is A, that is 1 only. Now if you look at this second question which was asked in the year 2018, it reads, increase in absolute and per capita real gross national product do not connote a higher level of economic development if. So basically it talks about the limitations of measuring economic growth through the concept of gross national product or the gross domestic product. Now we note that a country's gross national product might be growing, however, it might not be well distributed amongst the population of that country. And that is why it does not connote a proper or higher level of economic development if there is poverty and unemployment, or if the poverty and unemployment is increasing. So the correct answer here is C. So by looking at these questions, we find that the definitions of important terms related to the measurement of economic growth are important for us from the preliminary examination. and also looking at what are the limitations of calculating the economic growth by using these concepts like the gross national product, the gross domestic product, etc. So do have a proper understanding of these concepts, and for that you can go through the NCERT of class 12, that is the macroeconomics, where these concepts have been discussed in detail. Now if you look at this practice question, it reads, consider the following statements about the gross domestic product as a measure of economic growth. The first statement given is that if GDP of a nation increases, it necessarily leads to increase in the welfare of all. Second is that externalities are the benefits or the harms that a firm or an individual cause to another without being paid or penalized. And third is that the gross domestic product is always less than the gross national product of a country in an open economy. And we are asked to identify which of the statements that are given above is or are incorrect. So keep an eye on these words as to if the question is asking us to identify the correct statements or the incorrect statements. Now regarding the first statement, you will find that this is one of the biggest criticism of using gross domestic product as a measure of economic growth, because this does not take into account the welfare of all the sections of the society. And there are chances that even if the GDP of a nation is increasing, it might not lead to welfare of all the sections of the society. And this is because the wealth can get concentrated in hands of limited people or limited number of firms. And we already know that globally the problem of inequality is rising because of concentration of wealth in the hands of few people and few companies. And that is why this first statement that is given here, that is, if GDP of a nation increases, it necessarily leads to increase in the welfare of all, is incorrect. Again, if you look at the second statement, it reads, externalities are the benefits or the harms that a firm or an individual cause to another without being paid or penalized. Now, normally when the economic productivity of a firm or an individual is accounted for, it does not include the negative or the positive impacts that it has on the neighborhood or the society or the environment. Now in this, one of the biggest example of externalities is the pollution that is caused by the firms. And the cost of pollution is not accounted for in the economic productivity of that firm. Also, at times when an industry is set up in an area, and if that industry invests in the education or skilling of the labor, that is a positive externalities. And even that is not accounted for in the economic productivity of that firm or the individual. So that is why these externalities are simply either the benefits or the harms that a firm or an individual causes to another without being paid or penalized. And regarding more about externalities, you can go through the NCERT, where the GDP as a measure of welfare has been discussed in detail, and it talks about GDP and the welfare of all. It talks about externalities and other shortcomings of the gross domestic product as a measure of welfare. So accordingly, this statement that is given here is correct. Now if you look at this third statement, it talks about the relationship between the gross domestic product and gross national product of a country in an open economy. Now economies are normally defined as open or closed if the firms and the people of that country are allowed to invest outside the country, and vice versa, that is, people or industries from outside the country are allowed to invest in one's country. Now initially after independence, Indian economy was partially open. However, after the reforms of 1991, that is the liberalization, privatization and globalization, Indian economy has become considerably open in nature. Now if in an open economy, if the foreign direct investment is huge, then the gross domestic product of that country will be greater than that of the gross national product. However, if more people from the country are investing outside the country, and as compared to that, less people are investing within the country from outside, then in that case, the gross national product of a country will be more than that of the gross domestic product. And in a case where the gross national product is more than that of the gross domestic product, it does not necessarily lead to increase in the employment in one's country. So the statement third is just one scenario of the overall dynamics of open economy. However, it does not reflect the complete reality of an open economy, and as such, this statement given here is also incorrect because it is not necessary that always the gross domestic product is less than that of gross national product in an open economy. So if you look at the requirement of this question, we have been asked to identify the incorrect statement. So we find that the incorrect statements that are given in this question are the first statement and the third statement, and accordingly the correct answer that comes out is B, that is 1 and 3 only. With this, let's take up the next question now. Now the second question is related to another important indicator, that is GDP deflator, and it is used to measure inflation or the fluctuations in the prices in an economy. Now GDP deflator has simply been defined as the ratio of nominal GDP to the real GDP. And in this case, the nominal GDP refers to the value of gross domestic product at current prevailing prices. And the value of real GDP is calculated in such a way that the goods and services are evaluated at some constant set of prices. And if this ratio of nominal GDP to the real GDP is calculated, it tells us about the situation of prices in an economy regarding the goods and services that are produced within that economy. So this second question reads, which of the following statements is or are correct about the GDP deflator? First is that it reflects the changes in the price levels of a particular basket of goods and services produced within a country. And second is that it does not include the prices of the imported goods. Now, as we know that GDP deflator is calculated based on the ratio of nominal GDP to the real GDP, we note that GDP represents all the goods and services that are produced within the geographical boundaries of an economy, and it does not deal with any particular basket of goods and services. So in that case, this statement that is given here is incorrect because the GDP deflator reflects the price levels of all the goods and services that are produced within an economy. And as compared to the GDP deflator, we note that the wholesale price index and the consumer price index calculate the changes in the price levels based on the basket of goods and services. So this is a clear difference between the GDP deflator and the CPI as well as the WPI. And this question could be easily solved if you are clear with the definition of gross domestic product, because it is related to the goods and services which are produced within the geographical boundaries of an economy. The second statement is that it does not include the prices of imported goods, and which is also correct because it only looks at the goods and services which are produced within the economy and does not take into account the imported goods. On the other hand, if you compare this with the consumer price index, it reflects the items, goods or services which are consumed by the people, and they can at times include even imported goods and services. So it is clear that the GDP deflator does not include the prices of imported goods, and hence the second statement is correct. So by solving these two questions, we find that it is very important to understand the fundamentals or the basics of important definitions in the economy section. And the best guide for these fundamental definitions is the NCERT of class 12, that is the macroeconomics NCERT. So the correct answer here that comes out is B, that is 2 only. Now with this, let's take up the next question now. Now before solving this third practice question, let us look at the way in which previously questions have been asked related to the 5-year plans, an important economic policy of liberalization of 1991. So if you go through this question, it was asked in the year 2019, and this question related to the impact of liberalization of economic policies in 1991 was asked in the year 2017. So the question that was asked in 2019 reads, with reference to India's 5-year plans, which of the following statements is or are correct? Now in this question, the first statement reads that from the second 5-year plan, there was a determined thrust towards substitution of basic and capital good industries. Now this statement here is incorrect because this second 5-year plan did not focus on substitution of basic and capital good industries. However, it focused on improvement and growth in these basic and capital good industries. And as such, by this you can eliminate the options A and D outrightly. And if you look at the second statement, it reads the fourth 5-year plan adopted the objective of correcting the earlier trend of increasing concentration of wealth and economic power. Now, this fourth five-year plan was formulated between the year 1969 to 1974. And we note that this was the period when Indian politics was dominated by the slogan of Garibi Hatao. And this political slogan was also reflected in the objectives of the fourth five-year plan. And hence, as we note that the second statement is correct, the only option that we are left with is option B, that is 2 only. So as you can see, we first eliminated the incorrect statement, and after that we started searching for the correct statement, and that helps us easily identify answers in the multiple statement type questions. Again, if you look at this question that was asked in 2017, it reads, which of the following has or have occurred in India after its liberalization of economic policies in 1991? First is that the share of agriculture in the GDP has increased enormously, which is outrightly incorrect because we all know that post-liberalization, the share of service sector in the GDP growth rate of India has increased enormously, and agricultural contribution in the GDP has taken a back seat, and by this we can eliminate the options A and D directly. Again, if you look at the fourth statement, it reads, India's foreign exchange reserves increased enormously. So this statement is correct, as we note that the policy of liberalization, privatization and globalization in the year 1991 was necessitated because India's foreign exchange reserves were shrinking rapidly. And as such, one of the important consequences of the liberalization has been the increasing foreign exchange reserves with the Reserve Bank of India. So now if you look at the options, the only option that we are left with where the fourth statement has been mentioned is the option B, that is 2, 3 and 4 only. And other two statements are also correct, that is the share of India's exports in the world trade has increased and the FDI inflows have also increased. So now if you look at this practice question, it reads, which of the following was or were the reasons for the economic liberalization of 1991 in India? First is the high fiscal deficit for the government. Second is the depleting foreign exchange reserves. Third is high inflation. And fourth is the structural changes in the Indian economy. So if we have a look at the economic situation that prevailed in India in the late 1980s and early 1990s, you will find that there were several economic problems in India. Now, these economic problems were increased because of the ongoing Gulf War in the early 1990s, and that led to a spike in the crude oil prices across the globe. And as we know that India depends mainly upon the Middle Eastern region for its crude oil imports, this led to an increase in the oil prices in India, and the result was that it led to high inflation in India, as crude oil is one of the important inputs in the production of goods and services. Secondly, India was facing a balance of payment crisis because India's foreign exchange earnings were reducing continuously, and it had to pay a huge amount of foreign exchange for the import of crude oil. And we know that the prices of the crude oil were already increasing, and that led to a depletion in the foreign exchange reserves of India. And again, we note that government's social expenditure was increasing continuously, and that had led to a high fiscal deficit. And the debt of the government was also increasing continuously. So these were the three important reasons which necessitated the adoption of policy of economic liberalization. Now, regarding the fourth statement, it refers to the change in the dependency of an economy on particular sectors. And in this, we note that initially all the countries are dependent upon agricultural production, and from there on they move on to manufacturing, and ultimately they move on to the service sector. And that kind of a change in an economy is known as the structural change in an economy. However, if you go through India's economic history, you will find that the structural changes, that is dependency upon the services sector, has only increased or was a consequence of the policy of economic liberalization. And also, the structural changes are slow in nature, and they were not the primary reasons for the adoption of policy of economic liberalization. So the correct answer that comes out is C, that is 1, 2 and 3 only. So by solving these questions, we understand that a general understanding of the way in which Indian economy has moved after independence is extremely important for us from the exam point of view. And as we know that UPSC has asked questions based on these general understandings in the year 2019 and 2017. And about that, you can also read through the NCERT of class 11th, that is Indian Economic Development. With this, let's take up the next question now. Now, the next few questions that we are going to discuss are related to the fiscal policy or the fiscal dynamics of the central government. And in this regard, let us first look at the previous year questions related to the fiscal policy of the Government of India and how the questions have been asked in the preliminary examination. So if you look at this question, it was asked in the year 2018. And this was related to the recommendations of the N.K. Singh Committee regarding the fiscal responsibility and budget management review. So the first statement that the Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management Review Committee report has recommended a debt to GDP ratio of 60% for general, that is combined both for central as well as the state government by 2023, and it will comprise 40% of the central government's debt to GDP while 20% will be for state governments. So this statement that was given here was one of the recommendations of the N.K. Singh Committee. Again, if you look at the second statement, it reads the central government has domestic liabilities of 21% of GDP as compared to that of 49% of GDP of the state governments, which is incorrect because it is the reverse of it, that is 49% of the GDP's domestic liabilities are with central government while the liability with the state government is of 21% only. And regarding the third statement, it is also correct that as per the Constitution of India, it is mandatory for a state to take the central government's consent for raising any loan if the former owes any outstanding liabilities to the later. So the correct answer here was C, that is 1 and 3 only. So as you can see, questions related to the Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management Act are important for us from the preliminary examination point of view. Now if you look at this question that was asked in 2017, it is related to the trend of one of the important indicator, that is tax revenue as a percentage of GDP or tax to GDP ratio. And the second statement is regarding the trend of fiscal deficit of the Government of India as a percentage of GDP of India. So now the first statement that is given here is that tax revenue as a percentage of GDP of India has steadily increased in the last decade is an incorrect statement. And as you can see that, you should be aware of the important trends of important indicators which highlight the fiscal situation or fiscal position of the Government of India. And again, the second statement is also incorrect because the fiscal deficit as a percentage of GDP of India has not steadily increased in the last decade, and hence the correct answer was D, that is neither 1 nor 2. Further, if you look at this question that was asked in the year 2016, it talks about how to decrease the fiscal deficit of the Government of India. So the question reads, there has been a persistent deficit budget year after year. Which action or actions of the following can be taken by the Government of India to reduce this deficit? Now, if you look at the options closely, you will find that by introducing new welfare schemes, the expenditure of the Government of India will increase and it will further lead to the increase in the fiscal deficit. And hence, this is an incorrect option or solution for solving the problem of deficit. So by this, you can eliminate the options B and D outrightly. And if you look at the first and the third one, that is reducing revenue expenditure is a correct statement, and rationalizing of subsidies, both of these measures will reduce the expenditure of the government, and hence C comes out to be the correct answer here. That is 1 and 3 only are the measures which are required to be taken to reduce the deficit of Government of India. And again, this question was asked in the year 2016 and it talks about the composition of the capital budget of Government of India, or which all items are involved or incorporated into the capital budget of the Government of India. And in this, all the three, that is expenditure on the acquisition of assets like roads, buildings, machinery. Second is the loans received from the foreign governments. And third is the loans and advances granted to the states and union territories are correct. And hence the correct answer is D, 1, 2 and 3. So now if you look at these questions, some of them are conceptual in nature and some of them require us to identify the important trends in important indicators. And for questions like the deficit budget and also which all items are included under the capital budget, You can go through the macroeconomics NCRT of class 12th where these concepts have been discussed in detail. So regarding the capital budget, you should note that it is an account of the assets as well as the liabilities of the central government, which takes into consideration the changes in the capital. So if you look at the capital receipts, you will find that these include those receipts which create a liability or reduce the financial assets of the government of India. And it mainly includes the loans raised by the government from the public, which are called as the market borrowing. It also includes the borrowings by the government from the Reserve Bank and the commercial banks, and also loans received from the foreign governments and international organizations. And if you look at the capital expenditure, these are the expenditure of Government of India which result in the creation of physical or financial assets or the reduction in financial liabilities. And this includes expenditure on the acquisition of land, building, machinery. It also includes investment by the Government of India in shares and loans and advances by the central government that are forwarded to the state and the union territory governments. So if you look at the first and the third statements, these are included in the capital expenditure of the Government of India, while the second one is included under the capital receipts. So you should always be aware of the important heads that are included under the capital receipts, the capital expenditure, and revenue receipts of the Government of India. Now, after solving the previous year questions, let us look at this question which reads which of the following statements is or are correct. First is that central government's debt to GDP ratio has steadily increased in the last 5 years. And second is that the gross savings as a percentage of GDP has been decreasing steadily. Now again, this question has been framed from the economic survey of this year. And this economic survey talks about the important trends of important indicators which highlight the state of Indian economy. And in that, one of the key indicators is the debt to GDP ratio. Second is the gross savings as a percentage of GDP. Again, the economic survey talks about the gross investments as a percentage of GDP and various other trends. And you all should be aware that already the prelims compass of the economic survey and the government budget has been released. So do go through that before the preliminary examination to understand the key details of the state of Indian economy. And if you look at this question and go through this year's economic survey, you will find that the central government's debt to GDP ratio has not steadily increased. However, it has fluctuated. That is, in some years it has dropped. However, in other years it has increased. So there has not been a steadily increasing trend in the government's debt to GDP ratio. However, regarding the second thing, it has been one of the important concern which has been raised by the economic survey that India's gross savings have been falling. And it has provided a trending graph which provides that the gross savings as a percentage of GDP has been decreasing steadily. And in that case, the correct answer that comes out is B, that is 2 only. So while going through the economic survey and the government budget, do have an eye for all the important trends of important indicators. And various important trends related to the budget and the economic survey have been discussed in detail in the videos of Eco Survey and the budget that have been released. And also they have been provided in the prelims compass of budget and economic survey. So after this, let us take up the next question now. Now, if you look at this fifth question, it reads, which of the following factors have led to the breaching of fiscal deficit targets under the FRBM Act? Now, if you go through the economic survey of this year and the compilation of economic survey, which has been presented in the form of prelims compass of economic survey and budget, you will find that it has a chapter related to the fiscal developments in India. And in that chapter, it has been clearly highlighted that government's revenue has fallen down because of reduction in the corporate tax by the Government of India. And also due to the reduced demand, which is a consequence of the economic slowdown, there has been lower collections of the GST tax. And as such, the tax to GDP ratio has also dropped. So both these factors have led to the increase in fiscal deficit because of decrease in the revenue for the Government of India. However, these two other factors that have been given in the statement 3 and 4 have led to the increase in the government's income or government's revenue. However, this increase in revenue because of the transfer of dividend from the Reserve Bank of India to the government and increase in the disinvestment receipts has not been able to compensate the reduced revenue because of reduction in corporate tax or economic slowdown. And hence the correct answer that comes out is A, that is 1 and 2 only, that reduction in corporate tax, and economic slowdown have both contributed to the breaching of fiscal deficit targets. So do go through the reasons that have been provided in the economic survey regarding the various issues that are being faced in the Indian economy, and they will help you in solving the questions that appear in the preliminary examination related to the economic aspects. With this, let's take up the next question now. Now, the question number 6 and 7 are related to two important economic concepts, and the first is known as the liquidity trap, while the second one is known as the fiscal drag. So, the sixth question reads, which of the following refers to the situation of liquidity trap in an economy? And the options are that when there is high inflation and the interest rates are high, also when there is unemployment and the inflation are high, third is the growth is low and inflation is high, and fourth is when the interest rates are low and saving rates are high. Now, if you look at the concept of liquidity trap, it refers to an economic situation when the interest rates are low in an economy and that leads to high saving rates. So in this case, the correct answer that comes out is D. However, to understand this, you should understand that in such a scenario, the monetary policy becomes highly ineffective, and that is because the interest rates are already low, and in that scenario, the central banks cannot further reduce the interest rates to increase the investments by the consumers. And in such a scenario, one of the impact is that the consumers try to hoard as much cash as possible, and they do not invest in any kind of financial instrument, and also they do not invest in projects because of prevailing low interest rates. And in such a scenario, even when the central banks try to increase the investments or the consumer spending, it becomes highly ineffective because of prevailing low rates. So the situation is that the interest rates are low and the saving rates are high. And this liquidity trap situation prevails even when the central banks try to inject more and more liquidity in an economy, and even in that scenario, the consumers abstain from investing and spending. Now, if you go through the NCERT of macroeconomics of class 12th, in the third chapter you will find a concept known as demand for money. And in that, two types of demands of money have been provided. First is the transactive motive, that is, the money which is used for buying goods and services in an economy, and second is known as the speculative demand of money. And this demand of money, that is the speculative demand of money, is basically the demand of money which can be invested by the consumers so that they can earn interest on that money. And in that particular portion, the concept of liquidity trap has been explained beautifully in detail. So do go through that chapter to understand the various aspects of the situation of liquidity trap, and also what are two important types of demands of money, that is the transactive motive of the money and also the speculative motive of the money. And regarding the liquidity trap, you should understand that it is an economic scenario when the interest rates are low and that leads to high saving rates in the economy. And this is because the consumers abstain from investing and they try to hoard the cash. And in such a scenario also, the monetary policy by the central banks become ineffective because even when the central bank is trying to inject more liquidity, it does not lead to the increased investment or consumer spending. Now, normally the liquidity trap situation in an economy arises when there is high amount of deflation and also when the economy is under recession. And it is exactly in those times consumers abstain from spending more and they try to hoard as much cash as possible. So these are few important aspects regarding the liquidity trap situation. However, you should try and learn more about such important economic concepts or macroeconomic concepts. With this, let's take up the seventh question related to the term fiscal drag. So the seventh question reads, which of the following refers to the term fiscal drag? And the options that are given are the increase in debt of the government, increased welfare spending by the government, expansionary fiscal policy, and deflationary pressures because of progressive taxation. Now, if you look at this first option, it is related to the increase in the debt of the government, which is a result of the accumulation of fiscal deficits by the government across years. So basically, when the government budget is in deficit every year, it accumulates in the form of total debt of the government, which is a liability which needs to be returned by the government in the future. The second option relates to the increased welfare spending, and this aspect leads to increase in the fiscal deficit. The third option is known as expansionary fiscal policy, and this is when the government starts spending more, and it can include spending more on welfare spending and also on infrastructure development. So this means that all the three terms are not related to the term fiscal drag. Now, in order to understand fiscal drag, you should note that it is a situation when the inflation or income growth in an economy moves different taxpayers into higher tax brackets. And such a scenario prevails in a progressive taxation economy where there are different tax brackets for different income groups. Now, due to the inflation or increase in the income growth, what happens is that different people are dragged into higher tax brackets, and that leads to increased government tax revenue. This is because the person who was earlier paying lower taxes has now been dragged into a upper tax bracket or a higher tax bracket, and as such he or she has to now pay more tax to the government. And this increase in the tax revenue of the government happens even when the government is not actually increasing or changing the tax rates. Now, what happens or what is the effect of this thing happening in an economy is that it reduces the demand and also it reduces the consumer spending. And this is because now the consumers have to pay more tax to the government, and which is a result of increasing inflation or increase in the income growth or increase in the GDP. So what happens is that this leads to a deflationary drag on the economy, and this helps in curbing the problem of inflation. And such kind of progressive taxation is seen as an automatic stabilizer as it controls rapidly growing economy from overheating or inflation. Now, as compared to this progressive taxation, there is a term known as proportional taxation. And in the proportional taxation system, there are no tax brackets and the tax is levied similarly across all the income groups. Now, such kind of proportional taxation can be seen in the indirect taxes that are imposed in India. For example, it can include the sales tax, the goods and services tax, which all the members of the society have been subjected to at a similar rate. So, for example, even a person with higher income has to pay the same GST on a particular product as that of a poor person. An example of the progressive taxation is the income tax. And in that kind of scenario, there are different tax brackets for different income groups. So by solving these two questions, we understand that one should be very clear with the basic concepts of the economy, and they can be asked in your exam. And in that scenario, you will not be able to eliminate the options easily without knowing the actual meaning of the terms that are being asked in the exam. And in this case, the correct answer that comes out is D, that is, it leads to deflationary pressures because of progressive taxation in an economy. And this is because of increasing inflation or income growth, people are moved into higher tax bracket, and that leads to reduced consumer spending. And that is how deflationary pressures are imposed because of progressive taxation. With this, let's take up the next question now. Now, the next few questions that we will discuss are related to money and banking and decisions of Reserve Bank of India. Now, before solving those questions, let us look at the previous year questions related to this important theme. So, if you look at the year 2019, 3 questions have been asked, and in the year 2018, 1 question was asked related to money and banking. And if you go through this question that was asked in 2019, it requires us to identify which one of the following is not the most likely measure the government or the Reserve Bank of India takes to stop the slide of Indian rupee. And if you look at all these 3 options, they will help in arresting the fall in the currency or the depreciation of Indian rupee. And only following an expansionary monetary policy will not have any impact on the fluctuations in the exchange rate of rupee against other currencies. Again, if you look at this question, it reads, in the context of India, which of the following factors is or are the contributor or contributors to reducing the risk of currency crisis? Now in this, if you look at the options 1 and 2, they will lead to the appreciation in the currency because these 2 factors bring in important foreign exchange in India. That is the foreign currency earnings of India's IT sector, and also the remittances which are sent by Indians abroad helps in appreciation of the Indian currency. However, the second statement does not lead to reduction in the risk of currency crisis. So this can be easily eliminated, and the correct answer that comes out is B, that is 1 and 3. And in this question, the correct answer is D, that is following an expansionary monetary policy. Now, the third question, which is related to the concept of money multiplier, has been asked from the macroeconomics NCERT of class 12th. And in this, the question reads, the money multiplier in an economy increases with which one of the following? Now, if you look at the options that are given in this question, the first is the increase in the cash reserve ratio, second is the increase in statutory liquidity ratio, and last is the increase in population of the country. Now, in these options, in A and C, the banks keep a particular amount of money with them with the Reserve Bank. And in such a scenario, that money cannot be used for lending or re-lending. And as such, this cash is now stored or parked with the RBI, which is not into the circulation. Banking habit of the population is increased. It will lead to more amount of spending, re-lending and investment by the population. And as such, the correct answer that comes out is B. Now, the last option can be easily eliminated because even if the population of a country increase, it does not necessarily lead to increase in the banking habit. So the most appropriate answer here that is given is B. Now you can go through the NCERT of class 12th where this concept of money multiplier has also been explained in detail. Again, if you look at this question, it has also been asked from the macroeconomics NCERT of class 12th and it is related to the meaning of legal tender money. And we note that the legal tender money was in news because of the step that was taken by the government of India of demonetization. And the definition of the legal tender money that has been provided in the NCERT talks that it is the money which a creditor is under compulsion to accept in the settlement of his claims. So the correct answer is B. Again, if you look at this question that was asked in 2015, it reads about the component or the components of monetary policy. And it was a pretty straightforward question and you could have answered it by saying that the bank rate and the open market operations are the monetary policy tools which are used by the Reserve Bank of India. Hence, the correct answer is C1 and 2. Again, the question that was asked in 2017 was related to the Monetary Policy Committee. And in this, it is not a 12-member body and it is a 6-member body. And it decides the RBI's benchmark interest rates or the policy rates. So the correct answer is A, that is 1 only. And this question that was asked in 2016 was related to the marginal cost of funds lending or marginal cost of funds based lending rates or MCLR, which is announced by RBI. And in this, the first statement that these guidelines help to improve transparency in the methodology which is followed by the banks for determining the interest rates. And second, that these guidelines help ensure availability of bank credit at interest rates which are fair to the borrowers as well as the banks. Both are correct, that is C, that is both 1 and 2. So by looking at these previous year questions, you can understand that some questions are asked from the macroeconomics NCERT which are related to the basic concepts, while other are related to the important current issues like depreciating currency or any new framework which has been created by the Reserve Bank of India or related to the monetary policy of India. So after these, let us solve few questions based on these previous year questions. Now if you look at this 8th question, it reads, which of the following statements is or are correct about the Reserve Bank of India? The first is that under the RBI Act 1934, it is mandatory for the RBI to transfer all its profits to the government. And second is that the government cannot supersede the Reserve Bank of India board directions under any circumstances. Now, both these statements have been framed based on important current affairs that are related to the Reserve Bank of India. And both these aspects have been covered in detail in the Prelims Compass of Indian Economy. Now, the section 47 of the Reserve Bank of India Act 1934 requires the RBI to transfer the surplus reserves to the Government of India. However, it has not been mandated to transfer all its profits to the government, and it can keep provisions for the functioning of the Reserve Bank of India and other requirements of RBI. And as such, this first statement becomes incorrect. And the second statement is related to the section 7 of the RBI Act 1934, and it states that government can supersede the RBI board directions under certain circumstances. And again, this second statement is also incorrect. So the correct answer is D, that is neither 1 nor 2. So the government can supersede the Reserve Bank of India in the interest of public interests, and that has been provided in the section 7, and the section 47 provides the transfer of surplus reserves from the Reserve Bank of India to the Government of India. However, the RBI is not bound to transfer all its profits to the government. After this, let's take up this ninth question, which reads, which of the following statements is or are correct about the long-term repo operations conducted by the Reserve Bank of India? Now, this long-term repo operations or LTRO is a new monetary policy tool which is being used by the Reserve Bank of India to improve economic growth in India. Now, we already know that India is facing an economic recession, and in that scenario, even when the RBI has been reducing the repo rates, which are known as the policy rates, it has not led to increased growth. And as such, to increase long-term liquidity in the Indian economy, the RBI is using the long-term repo operations. So the first statement reads, interest rate offered by the RBI on the LTRO is 1% higher than the repo rate. And second is that it aims at improving the monetary policy transmission. Now, this first statement that is given here is incorrect because the interest rate that is being offered by the RBI is similar to that of the repo rate. However, the only difference is in terms of the period for which this kind of repo operation is being conducted. And these repos are being lent at 1 year and 3 year maturity period. And second statement given here is correct because it aims at improving the monetary policy transmission and improving the liquidity situation in India. So the correct answer here is B, that is 2 only. And both these questions and aspects have been discussed in detail in the Prelims Compass of Indian Economy. So do go through that booklet and try and understand various other important current affairs related to economy. With this, let's take up the next question now. And finally, let us look at this 10th and the last question in this discussion, which reads, which of the following statement is correct about negative interest rate monetary policy? And the options are that it is implemented by the central banks to reduce environmental impact, it is a policy tool used for social welfare, it is implemented to control inflation during the times of high economic growth, and last is that it is used to spur the growth during economic recession. Now, all these options that have been provided in this question relate to the objective or key aim of using a negative interest rate monetary policy. Now, simply this negative interest rate monetary policy refers to a situation when the banks are required to pay interest to the central banks if they try to park their surplus reserves with the central banks. So, for example, if Indian banks want to park their money with the Reserve Bank of India, they will have to pay an interest on that money, and they will not receive interest from the Reserve Bank of India for parking their surplus reserves. Now, what this kind of policy does is that it encourages the banks to provide loans at cheaper rates instead of parking their funds with the central banks. And generally, this kind of a negative interest rate policy or monetary policy is followed by the central banks to spur economic growth during the times of economic recessions. And this has been followed in countries like Japan, Switzerland, etc. Now, we note that in India, the banks park their surplus reserves with the Reserve Bank of India for a short period of time, and the interest rate that is provided by the Reserve Bank of India on those banks' deposits is known as the reverse repo rate. However, in the scenario of negative interest rate monetary policy, the RBI starts charging interest from the banks themselves. So this is the scenario of negative interest rate monetary policy, and the correct answer here is that it is used to spur economic growth during the times of recession.